One of the world's most iconic fighter jets is slowly fading away. Few aircraft in history have captured the public imagination quite like the Harrier Jump Jet. Even people with only a passing interest in aviation have seen the famous demonstrations of a fighter aircraft lifting off from a tiny patch of pavement, hovering above the ground, and then accelerating away as though the normal rules of flight simply don't apply. But what makes the Harrier almost unique even today is that it was the answer to a very specific military problem that emerged at the height of the Cold War. Planners on both sides of the Iron Curtain realised that if a major conflict broke out between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, many of the air bases that Western air power depended on might not survive not only during the opening days, but possibly not even the opening hours of a war. By the late 1950s and early 60s, this vulnerability was becoming more and more worrying for military planners throughout NATO. Various strategies were studied to counter the problem, but the reality is that air bases are difficult to defend and obviously impossible to hide. And worse still, a runway did not need to be completely destroyed in order to become unusable. Just a handful of relatively small but well-placed craters in the runways or taxiways could prevent aircraft from taking off or landing. With some forethought, it would be possible to make runway repairs relatively quickly, at least for resilient aircraft like the C-130 or C-17 now, but fighters and other fast jets require smoother runways, and simply filling up a crater with some dirt and concrete just wouldn't do the job. Until proper repairs are done, an entire fighter wing could potentially remain grounded at the exact moment they were needed most. And NATO expected that any war in Europe would begin with intense attacks against critical infrastructure. Airfields, command centres, logistics hubs, and communication and transport networks would all be targeted in the first few minutes of any war to disrupt military operations as much as possible before they could get fully going. Basically, all of Central Europe would instantly turn into a highly contested environment. Now, British planners were particularly concerned with supporting their forces in northern Germany, where a rapid Warsaw Pact advance could quickly place enormous pressure on both ground units and the airfields supporting them. And at the same time, NATO accepted that Warsaw Pact countries had the advantage when it came to ground forces in general and tanks in particular. And so, to counter that, NATO would have to rely on its own strengths: tactical air power. Aircraft of all shapes and sizes would be needed to stop advancing armoured columns and the forces supporting them, while providing close air support to friendly ground forces and redeploy quickly when necessary. And every single time planners run scenarios to see how all of this would actually work, they run into the same problem: the dependence on those large, vulnerable air bases. So what alternatives were there at the time? Well, one is a process called dispersal, having multiple smaller air bases to spread out your forces, but this can only help up to a certain point. Now, I know there are some different schools of thought here. For example, Sweden and other countries make a habit of landing aircraft on specially prepared roads. But for the most part, conventional fighters still require conventional runways. Even aircraft designed for relatively short field performance need prepared strips of pavement long enough to accelerate safely, take off with useful amounts of fuel and weapons, and recover at the end of a mission to get refueled and rearmed and repaired if necessary. And while the ability to move aircraft from one airfield to another might make them slightly harder to target, it didn't fundamentally solve the problem of runway dependence. Now, a lot of work went into making air bases less vulnerable, or making runways easier to repair, or both really, but some planners decided to reframe the problem. If we simply accept that one way or another, those vital air bases and their runways will eventually become unusable, can we find a way for NATO to still have the necessary air power to stop a Soviet advance across Europe? Britain's answer to that question would eventually become one of the most unusual combat aircraft ever built. British planners, and actually quite a few others before them, started brainstorming on figuring out how to make a fighter that, instead of operating from traditional airfields, would be capable of using locations that would be completely impractical for any other fighter. Anything from small clearings hidden in forests to road sections, improvised pads scattered across the countryside, or even sites close to the front line that could be prepared last minute. They all became part of the concept. And of course, operating from such small places makes the dispersal strategy so much more effective. In wartime, an aircraft could launch from one location, carry out a strike, and then recover to an entirely different site whose position had been kept secret until the very last moment. So instead of forcing an enemy to neutralise a handful of major air bases, NATO could potentially disperse its air power across dozens or potentially even hundreds of small operating locations, which only needed a bit of open space and a hidden store of fuel and weapons that would be far more difficult to identify and destroy. And that was the real promise of what would eventually lead to the Harrier. Even if NATO was completely surprised and runways were obliterated without any kind of warning, here was a tactical aircraft that would still be capable of taking off, carrying weapons into battle, and returning to fight again. Now, the challenge, of course, was figuring out how to build such an aircraft in the first place. And I'll tell you more about that after this. One of the recurring themes in aviation is that every single design has its challenges, and Harrier is a perfect example of this. Engineers wanted an aircraft that could take off and land almost anywhere, so they had to create an incredibly innovative solution. But as with any engineering challenge, every design choice has compromises, and the trick is understanding which compromises are actually worth making. And interestingly, you can find the same principle in everyday products. Take shaving, for example. For years, razor manufacturers have added more blades, lubrication strips, and other features designed to make shaving more comfortable. But many of these are solutions to problems created elsewhere in the design. And one of the biggest problems is blade movement. Most cartridge razors allow the blades to flex and pivot independently, which sounds helpful, but that movement can actually create inconsistency, tugging, and irritation. So instead of addressing the root cause, manufacturers often end up just treating the symptoms. Henson, however, took a different approach. Instead of building workarounds around the problem, they focused on the blade itself. Their razor holds the blade rigidly in place at a precise angle, helping deliver a smooth, more consistent shave with less irritation. It's also designed by aerospace machinists, which probably explains why they're so obsessed with precision and tolerances. So to get yours, scan this QR code or head to hensonshaving.com/now and use the code NOW to get 100 free blades with the purchase of a razor. Thanks Henson Shaving for sponsoring the video. Now, let's get back to the Harrier. Now, at first glance, building an aircraft that fits this kind of mission is fairly straightforward. To make an aircraft that can take off vertically, all you really need is an engine that can propel it upwards with more force than the gravity that's pulling it back towards the ground. But the problem, of course, is that fighter aircraft are heavy and jet engines can only produce a finite amount of thrust. So the problem becomes power to weight ratio. Ultimately, fuel is heavy, weapons are heavy, landing gear and avionics are heavy. Even the structure required to hold everything together adds weight. And it's important to bear in mind here that fighters have to pull lots of G, with obviously 1G being the force of gravity. And that means that when these aircraft are subjected to multiple Gs, their wings and the structure that supports them must be capable of keeping aircraft in one piece. So let's put that into perspective. If a fighter weighs 16 tons and then goes and pulls 9 Gs during a dogfight, which they often do, those little wings and the supporting structures are now supporting an aircraft that effectively weighs 9 times that weight, in this case 144 tons. That's the weight of a Boeing 777-200. So in order to be capable of this, it needs to be strong. And every pound of weight added to the aircraft to make it strong increases the amount of thrust required to lift it vertically. And every bit of weight devoted to making hovering possible is also weight that cannot be used to make the aircraft fly faster, travel further, or carry more stuff. Even conventional fighters are difficult to keep under a desired weight, and all the trade-offs involved in something like the Harrier have frustrated aircraft designers for decades. Now, obviously, helicopters have demonstrated that designing machines capable of taking off and landing vertically and then transitioning to horizontal flight was perfectly possible. But the challenge was building a combat aircraft that could take off like a helicopter and could still operate like a fighter once it was airborne. And this proved to be one of the greatest engineering challenges of the jet age. And this challenge intrigued many aircraft designers throughout the 1950s. Multiple engineering teams around the world experimented with a variety of concepts. Most of those efforts involved the use of multi-lift only engines that pointed straight downwards during takeoff and landing, while one or more separate engines provided forward thrust for normal flight. Others experimented with tilting entire wings or rotating propulsion systems. Now, on paper, many of these concepts appeared promising, but in practice, they generally suffered from the same fundamental problem. They just carried around too much dead weight. Clearly, the only purpose of those dedicated lift engines was to help the aircraft leave the ground vertically, and then their job is done until it's time to land again. Once the aircraft transitions into forward flight, those lift engines are essentially like unwanted cargo. They continue to occupy space and increase fuel consumption because of their weight, despite contributing nothing towards the aircraft performance for the remainder of the flight. And unlike cargo, they can't be removed. Now, that might sound like an acceptable compromise, but remember, weight is the enemy of all aircraft. Those lift engines and the fuel that they consume added up to thousands of pounds, which means that they reduce capacity for weapons while reducing the amount of fuel available for crews and therefore range and performance. One experimental aircraft that was developed in Britain called the Shaw SC.1 demonstrated this problem perfectly. It could take off and land vertically just fine, and by many accounts it was actually easier to control than some of the aircraft that would follow, which matters because controllability is a non-negotiable. But the problem was that the SC.1 required multiple engines to work, which meant that it was enormously complex to operate and maintain. Every additional engine introduced new systems, new failure modes that had to be studied and mitigated against, and new maintenance requirements. The SC.1 proved that vertical flight was possible, but it also highlighted why so many VTOL concepts struggled to move beyond the experimental stage. And the same thing happened with the Dassault Mirage 3V, which had a whopping 8 lift engines. And years later in the 1970s, the Soviets would introduce an aircraft called the Yak-38, which looked much more elegant, but which also relied on separate lift engines and suffered from the same issues: very short range and limited weapons capacity. Back in the late 1950s, it was becoming increasingly clear to British engineers that if they wanted a practical combat aircraft capable of operating away from traditional runways, they would need a fundamentally different approach. And that breakthrough came from an elegant idea that seems obvious in hindsight. Forget about using one set of engines for vertical flight and another for forward flight, and just come up with a way to use the same engines for both. And that idea eventually evolved into what would become the Pegasus, one of the most remarkable aircraft engines ever built. Rather than generating thrust in a fixed direction like a conventional jet, the Pegasus was designed to redirect its thrust through 4 swiveling nozzles mounted around the aircraft's centre of gravity. The front 2 nozzles drew air from a high pressure compressor, and the rear 2 drew hot air from behind the combustor. The prototype aircraft this engine was fitted to was the Hawker Siddeley Kestrel, and I think you can see how similar it looked to what would eventually become the Harrier. So when the nozzles pointed rearward, the aircraft behaved just like a conventional jet. But as the nozzles rotated downward, more and more of the engine's thrust was directed towards the ground. And eventually, all of the engine's power could be used to support the aircraft's weight and lift it vertically into the air. It was an extraordinarily clever solution because it eliminated the dead weight problem that had plagued so many earlier designs. That same engine that powered the aircraft through the sky was also responsible for lifting it off the ground. Nothing sat idle once the aircraft transitioned into forward flight. Every pound of machinery contributed to the mission from takeoff to landing. Now, while the concept sounds relatively simple on paper, turning it into a practical combat aircraft required solving a long list of problems that nobody had ever encountered before. For one thing, note where the engine actually is in relation to the fuselage in both the Kestrel and the Harrier. In most fighter jets, the engine or engines are sitting towards the rear, but in the Harrier, the Pegasus is sitting literally in the middle, and the rest of the aircraft is essentially built around it. And then there comes the question of actually operating this thing. A Harrier pilot has to learn how to manage an aircraft that can transform from a hovering machine into a high-speed jet and back again, all while remaining controllable throughout every stage of the transition, which is definitely easier said than done. The The engineers had to figure out how to make the aircraft hover, but they still had to figure out how to keep it controllable while doing so, and in a way that would feel natural to its pilots. In a conventional aircraft, the flow of oncoming air across the wings and tail provides most of the control forces that allow a pilot to pitch, roll and yaw the aircraft. But a hovering or even a slow moving Harrier is not moving through the air fast enough for those control surfaces to work. So instead, engineers had to create an entirely different control system that used small reaction nozzles located in the nose, the tail and the wingtips. And these nozzles use bleed air, basically high pressure compressed air from the engine, and when that bleed air is sent to individual nozzles, it allowed the pilot to maneuver the aircraft while hovering. It's a similar concept to what spacecraft use to maneuver and reorientate themselves in space. And the result was an aircraft that demanded an unusual combination of skills. A Harrier pilot had to think like a conventional fighter pilot while flying at high speed, but also like a helicopter pilot while operating close to the ground at slow speeds. And transitioning between those two flight regimes required constant attention, particularly in the earlier variants. Pilots not only had to manage the throttle, but also a separate nozzle control lever that determined how much thrust was directed downward versus rearward. Move those controls correctly though, and the aircraft could perform remarkable feats. But move them incorrectly, and things could go wrong very quickly. When a Harrier is in the hover, it's balancing on top of a column of thrust. Picture balancing a broom on one hand with the handle at the bottom and the bristles at the top. That balance is very precarious, and obviously we're talking 1950s and 1960s technology here, so no fly-by-wire or flight control computers to help pilots transition from forward to hover mode. As a result, training pilots to fly the Harrier was a pretty unique process. And a good friend of mine who flew the Harrier for the Royal Air Force was kind enough to give me some fascinating insights into some of the more unique quirks of flying the Harrier operationally. And the first one that I found really interesting centered around why it was really bad to over-control this aircraft. Now, over-controlling aircraft is a common trait that I often see in new pilots, irrespective of aircraft type. And ultimately, it's when a pilot applies lots of unnecessary inputs to the control column or stick in an attempt to try and fly as accurately as possible, but often has the opposite effect. In a conventional aircraft, this can make for a bit of an uncomfortable ride or possibly destabilize the approach. But in a Harrier, the effects of over-controlling can be far more severe. You see, when the Harrier is in the hover, its engine is usually operating at maximum thrust. Now, that's not a problem in itself, but the nozzles located at the nose, the tail and the wingtips, which provide pitch and roll control, take bleed air from the compressor. So when the pilot moves the stick left or right or forward or aft, it physically opens valves that port that high pressure bleed air from the engine compressor to the correct nozzles, which in turn pitches or rolls the aircraft. So if the aircraft is in the hover and the pilot wants to roll left, for example, they'll move the stick to the left as usual, which will open the nozzle valve on the right wing. This enables high pressure air to shoot out of the right nozzle, and thanks to Newton's third law, which says that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, it'll push the right wing up and therefore the left wing down, giving the pilot the left roll they intended. But here comes the tricky bit. The more you move the stick, the more bleed air is taken from the engine. And with less compressed air going into the combustion chamber, less fuel can be added, and ultimately the available thrust is reduced. So if a pilot is in the hover and starts over-controlling, moving the stick left and right, forward and back unnecessarily, they'll be opening up all the nozzle valves in quick succession, bleeding lots of air from the compressor, which will significantly reduce the power output from the engine. And now we're in a position where the aircraft is in the hover close to the ground and the weight of the aircraft exceeds the thrust being produced and the aircraft begins to descend. Not a nice feeling. But thankfully the fix is relatively easy. Just reduce your control inputs and the air stops being bled from the engine, thrust is restored and the aircraft stops descending. But this example really highlights the unique challenges involved in flying the Harrier, and a good bit of advice often given to new Harrier pilots was, if the aircraft does something it shouldn't, just undo whatever it was you just did and that'll likely fix it. Yet, despite those challenges, the Harrier gradually matured into exactly the kind of aircraft that NATO had hoped for. Throughout the Cold War, Royal Air Force Harriers routinely practiced operating from dispersed sites across West Germany, proving that they could launch, then land, rearm, refuel, and launch again from locations that would have been tricky to find and impossible for conventional jets to use. The concept that had seemed almost radical in the 1950s and 60s was becoming a practical military capability, and its greatest test would come in 1982 during the Falklands War. When Argentina invaded the islands, Britain faced the enormous challenge of projecting air power around 8,000 miles from home. But the Royal Navy's relatively small aircraft carriers carried the Sea Harrier, which proved to be one of the UK's most potent weapons in the fight for the islands. And although the Sea Harrier was neither the fastest nor the most heavily armed fighter in the conflict, it proved extraordinarily effective. Operating from carriers that couldn't have supported conventional Navy fighters, Sea Harriers provided air defence for the British fleet and helped establish air superiority over the islands. And about a decade later, the aircraft would once again demonstrate its value during Operation Desert Storm, this time mainly in the hands of the US Marines. Their AV-8B Harriers were built by McDonnell Douglas in the United States under licence, and the Marine pilots flew them from expeditionary locations and amphibious ships, flying thousands of sorties. And by their very nature, Harriers could operate much closer to the front lines, reducing response times and allowing Marine commanders to call upon air support more rapidly. The aircraft's ability to combine jet performance with extraordinary base flexibility continued to make it useful even as more advanced fighters entered service. But perhaps inevitably, the same feature that made the Harrier revolutionary eventually became one of the reasons for its retirement. Again, all aircraft are compromises, and the Harrier is more so than most. And this aircraft's penalties in range, payload, speed and complexity started catching up with it. The design also meant that updating the design with newer technologies in avionics, sensors and other systems was both difficult and very costly. And by the third decade of this century, engineers in both Britain and the United States had already been updating it for over 60 years. So eventually it was time for a brand new replacement, whose engineers tried to preserve a lot of the Harrier's flexibility while eliminating many of its weaknesses, which led to the creation of the F-35B Lightning II. Like the Harrier, the F-35B can operate from small ships and austere locations without requiring a conventional runway. But unlike the Harrier, it combines that capability with stealth technology, advanced sensors, networked warfare systems, and performance that far exceeds what the older aircraft could provide, including supersonic flight. And of course, it now has fly-by-wire, which means that flying it is now much easier and more predictable. And so, although the F-35B achieves vertical flight using a completely different propulsion system, its mission remains remarkably similar. It exists because military planners still value the ability to fly combat aircraft from places where traditional fighters just simply can't. Today, the Harrier is gradually disappearing from military service. The United Kingdom retired its fleet in 2010, while the United States completed its transition away from the AV-8B in June 2026. So now only a handful of Harriers still remain in service with Spain and Italy, and Italy is preparing to replace its Harriers with the F-35B, while Spain's intentions, well, they're a bit less clear. But in any case, despite its gradual retirement, the Harrier has secured its place in history. It was never the fastest nor the most heavily armed fighter of its era, but its design has solved a problem that many believed could not be solved. But what do you think? Have you ever watched an airshow where a Harrier demonstrated its flying ability? And would you like to see them being sold to private owners so that they can continue flying after official retirement? Let me know in the comments below. And also, let us know what other aircraft you'd like me to cover. I'm Ben Watts, you are watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.